He was born into power, not just power of crown and sword, but of legacy. The Holy Roman Empire, that great patchwork of kingdoms and principalities, needed a ruler who could balance politics with piety, diplomacy with dominance. And Emperor Frederick II, crowned in the early 13th century, was just that man. They called him Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. He spoke 6 languages, kept scholars and philosophers at his court, and corresponded with Muslim leaders as easily as he did with Christian kings. He was a man of vision and ambition. But he was also a man of flesh. And one day, in a corner of his empire where Sicily met the sea, he laid eyes upon the woman who would alter the course of European history. Her name was Bianca Lancia, daughter of a powerful northern Italian noble house. She was striking, with dark, intelligent eyes and a proud, noble bearing. She had been educated, rare for women of her time, and was known not only for her beauty but for her wit and resolve. Their meeting was not arranged, nor was it welcomed. It was fated. Bianca was not a suitable match for an emperor, not in the eyes of the Vatican, nor the German princes who expected Frederick to secure the empire's future through political marriage. He was already entangled in dynastic politics, bound by papal expectations to form alliances through carefully selected unions. The Pope had long viewed Frederick with suspicion, too worldly, too tolerant of Islam, too bold in his reforms. A marriage born of love, especially to a woman without papal approval, would be seen as rebellion. And yet, Frederick pursued Bianca. Not as an emperor seeking a queen, but as a man gripped by obsession. For years, they lived in the shadow of scandal. She became his mistress, then his secret consort, and eventually bore him children. Whispers began to circulate that Frederick had married her in secret, in defiance of both canon law and political reason. The church would not recognize their union, and Bianca would never be crowned empress. But what made their love dangerous was not only its secrecy. It was the timing. The Holy Roman Empire was already a fragile web of loyalties, princes in Germany, dukes in Burgundy, kings in Italy, each barely held together under Frederick's rule. With the Pope watching his every move, with rival claimants eager to stir dissent, Frederick's open defiance in matters of marriage was seen as a breach not of morality, but of order. And Bianca? She was no silent figure. She had opinions on court matters, influence over Frederick's decisions, and a presence that challenged the traditional image of a passive, obedient imperial consort. She represented a new kind of power, emotional, personal, and unpredictable. And that terrified the men in Rome. When Bianca bore Frederick a son, the situation grew more volatile. Was the boy legitimate? Would Frederick try to name him heir over his older, papally approved children? Would the empire be divided by competing bloodlines? These questions rippled through the courts of Europe. The Pope, already in conflict with Frederick over his delays in launching a crusade, now had new ammunition. A scandalous marriage. A possible illegitimate heir. A defiance of church authority not in war, but in love. Thus began the slow unraveling, a personal affair destined to become a political earthquake. In the gilded halls of Palermo and the dark marble corridors of the imperial palaces in Germany, there were always whispers. They followed Bianca Lancia like a shadow, a noblewoman elevated not by bloodline or marriage contract, but by the affections of the emperor himself. At first, the court dismissed her as a passing indulgence. Frederick II, after all, was known for his appetite, for knowledge, for luxury, and for women. But Bianca was no ordinary mistress. She walked with purpose, her presence quiet but commanding. Her chambers were never empty of petitioners, and her opinions often echoed in the emperor's decrees. It didn't take long before the nobility realized Bianca Lancia was not simply in the emperor's bed, she was in his confidence. The court began to murmur. Nobles who once curried favor with Frederick found themselves outmaneuvered by allies of the Lancia family. Papal envoys, once welcomed, were kept waiting. Bianca, some said, had turned the emperor's heart away from Rome. Others whispered darker things, that she was a sorceress, that she read forbidden texts, that her influence was unnatural. But it wasn't magic. It was love. Or something like it. Frederick, ever the philosopher king, believed in reason above dogma. He saw in Bianca a kindred spirit, someone unafraid to challenge convention, someone who loved him not for the throne, but despite it. And for a man constantly besieged by politics, rebellions, and papal threats, that kind of love was rare, and dangerously precious. Still, the Holy Roman Empire was not built to accommodate such passions. In Germany, the electors grew restless. Frederick's older son by his previous wife, Henry, had once been crowned king of the Romans, heir to the imperial throne. But Henry had rebelled and was imprisoned. Now, Frederick's illegitimate children by Bianca were being raised in Sicily, and one, Manfred, showed signs of becoming his favorite. This ignited fear. If Bianca's children were elevated, what of the legitimate dynastic line? What of the balance of power? The empire was built on alliances, fragile, transactional, and deeply Catholic. Frederick's union with Bianca, lacking any papal blessing, threatened to upend centuries of precedent. And so the whispers turned to plotting. German nobles questioned the emperor's fitness to rule. Italian cardinals whispered to the Pope that the empire was falling under heretical influence. Bianca's Lancia relatives were accused of corruption, of enriching themselves at court. Rumors flew that Frederick was preparing to legitimize Manfred, an unthinkable act without the Pope's approval. The Church responded with fury. Pope Gregory IX, already enraged by Frederick's delays in crusading and his growing independence, now had moral grounds for condemnation. He declared the emperor's court to be a den of vice. He painted Frederick not as a ruler, but as a seducer, a man ruled by lust, not law. In secret councils, the Pope began to discuss Frederick's excommunication. And in backrooms and cloisters across Europe, his cardinals whispered about a greater possibility, the deposition of the emperor himself. Frederick remained defiant. He would not cast Bianca aside. He would not name a wife for diplomacy. And he certainly would not bow to Rome's dictates on love. But the cost of defiance was growing. Where once there had been uneasy loyalty, there was now conspiracy. Where once the empire had moved under one crown, it now braced for division. All because of a woman the Church refused to name empress, and an emperor who refused to let her go. And so the whispers deepened, quiet at first, then louder, until they became the storm that would split the empire itself. It did not take place in a grand cathedral. There were no gathered kings, no papal blessing, no golden trumpets to herald its sanctity. And yet, the union of Emperor Frederick II and Bianca Lancia would echo louder than any royal wedding before it, not for its celebration, but for its rebellion. It is said that the marriage happened late in Bianca's life, perhaps even on her deathbed. Some chroniclers claim it was a final act of love, others that it was a desperate attempt to legitimize their children. But whether solemnized in secret long before or hastily arranged near the end, one truth became indisputable: Frederick, ruler of Christendom's greatest political machine, had wed the woman Rome had forbidden him to love. The moment word reached the Vatican, the halls of power recoiled. To the Church, it was an insult that struck at the heart of papal authority. Not only had Frederick married without the Pope's consent, but he had done so in direct defiance of repeated warnings and sanctions. This was not just a breach of etiquette. It was open war. The Pope at the time, either Gregory IX or his successor Innocent IV, depending on the exact timing, moved swiftly. Frederick's excommunication, previously hanging in the air like a sword above his throne, was now made absolute. Letters were sent to Europe's monarchs declaring that the emperor had made a mockery of Christian marriage. The Church no longer recognized him as the legitimate defender of the faith. Even in the emperor's own lands, the tremors were felt. German princes who had once stood cautiously by him now saw an opportunity to shift alliances. The idea of an illegitimate Sicilian-born child becoming heir to the empire was unthinkable. It violated every code of feudal hierarchy. It disturbed the delicate balance between north and south, between imperial crown and ecclesiastical mitre. Frederick, ever the strategist, tried to downplay the significance of the marriage. He emphasized his political achievements, his military strength, his cultural contributions. He claimed his personal choices were outside Rome's jurisdiction. But the damage had been done, not only to his standing but to the very structure of the Holy Roman Empire. Noble houses divided. Some remained loyal to the emperor, inspired by his defiance and seduced by the promise of rewards. Others declared their allegiance to the Pope, calling for Frederick's deposition and supporting rival claimants. The empire, already a loose confederation, began to splinter in practice as well as theory. Meanwhile, Bianca remained largely unseen, a ghostly figure in the chronicles, present in absence, spoken of in whispers, the subject of speculation and scorn. Some painted her as a temptress who had bewitched an aging emperor. Others, more sympathetic, called her a tragic queen denied her crown, whose love had changed the course of history. But whether hero or harlot, her marriage had become the empire's fault line. The ceremony itself, likely small, perhaps attended only by close confidants, became mythologized. Poets wrote of it as a romantic rebellion. Priests denounced it as heresy. And in the political courts of Europe, it was cited as the moment Frederick II lost control of his empire. What should have been a private vow between two lovers became a weapon wielded by both allies and enemies. For the Holy Roman Empire was not ruled only by strength and law, it was ruled by perception, and perception had turned against its emperor. With one vow, whispered over a dying woman's hand or spoken defiantly before witnesses in Sicily, Frederick had not just wed Bianca Lancia, he had wed controversy, and in doing so, invited the collapse of everything he had built. The tension between Emperor Frederick II and the papacy had long simmered beneath the surface, but the scandalous marriage to Bianca Lancia lit the fuse. What had once been a tug-of-war between spiritual and temporal authority now erupted into open conflict, a war of thrones and altars. The Pope, now Innocent IV, viewed Frederick not merely as a rebellious monarch, but as a heretic cloaked in royal robes. Rome had tolerated kings with appetites before. But Frederick was different. He defied papal decrees, questioned church supremacy, and now had married a woman the Pope had deliberately excluded from imperial legitimacy. The union symbolized not just lust, but theological defiance, a direct challenge to the Church's right to approve, bless, or deny a royal marriage. The Holy Roman Emperor, God's supposed earthly sword, had stepped beyond the bounds of sacred law. And the Pope, shepherd of Christendom, would answer not with sermons, but with damnation. In 1245, Pope Innocent IV convened the First Council of Lyon. It was a political ambush masked in holy robes. Frederick, though invited, did not attend. The Pope, seizing the absence as guilt, declared him excommunicated again, and this time went further. He proclaimed Frederick deposed. It was unprecedented. A sitting emperor, elected by princes and crowned in Rome, had been stripped of divine legitimacy by the church he was meant to defend. The official reason? Disobedience, heresy, and treason against Christendom. But unofficially, many knew what fueled the Pope's fury. the emperor's continued defiance in marrying Bianca without ecclesiastical consent and attempting to legitimize their children. Rome thundered with condemnation. But across the empire, reaction was fractured. Some German princes, long resentful of Frederick's centralizing policies, saw an opportunity. They turned their backs on him and supported rival claimants to the throne, namely Henry Raspey and later William of Holland. These puppet kings, backed by papal gold and blessing, were tools to fracture the empire from within. Civil war loomed. Armies marched under both cross and crown. But Frederick, ever the master of diplomacy and strategy, did not buckle. He responded with fire, both literal and rhetorical. His letters painted the Pope as a false shepherd, a corrupt cleric more concerned with power than salvation. He reminded Europe of his scholarly reputation, his accomplishments in law and science, and his cultural achievements. In contrast, he portrayed the Pope as a warmonger hiding behind holy vestments. Yet, even his brilliance could not hold together what was falling apart. The Church began to turn every element of his reign into heresy. His tolerance of Muslims? Proof of apostasy. His laws limiting papal power in Sicily? Evidence of sedition. His wedding to Bianca? A mockery of sacrament and authority. And with every sermon, every papal bull, the spiritual fabric of the empire unraveled further. Monasteries loyal to Rome began to preach against their emperor. Bishops hesitated to collect taxes for his armies. Religious orders condemned his children with Bianca as bastards, unfit for inheritance. Even loyal nobles began to question whether divine wrath was falling upon the empire for Frederick's sins. The crown and the cross had once ruled Europe together, inseparable, like the sun and moon. But now, the cross turned against the crown. And in this holy war, the battlefield was not just blood and land, but belief itself. Frederick still held castles, commanded armies, and maintained the loyalty of parts of Italy and Germany. But spiritually, his throne was crumbling. The Pope had not only excommunicated a man, he had isolated a soul. And in the court of public perception, that was often more fatal than any sword. By the mid-13th century, the Holy Roman Empire was no longer a coherent force. It was a patchwork quilt torn at the seams, sewn with loyalty, unraveled by ambition. And the thread that pulled it apart was not just papal wrath or imperial arrogance. It was blood. Frederick too had many sons. Some were born of political marriages, others from liaisons like the one with Bianca Lancia. And though Bianca's children were long considered illegitimate by the Church, Frederick's defiant love made them central to his vision of dynastic continuity. That choice would prove fateful. When Frederick's eldest legitimate son, Henry VII, rebelled against him, the emperor imprisoned him, a decision that shocked the court and humiliated the German nobility who had once rallied behind Henry as king of the Romans. With Henry removed, Frederick increasingly leaned on his Sicilian-born sons, especially Manfred, Bianca's bold and intelligent child, and later Conrad, born from his marriage to Isabella of England. But the empire could not endure so many claimants with different mothers, different ambitions, and different cultural identities. German princes refused to accept a southern, half-Italian heir raised in Palermo. Italian nobles distrusted northern interference. And Rome, ever watchful, whispered that no child of Bianca Lancia would sit on the imperial throne with divine blessing. When Frederick died in 1250, the succession crisis erupted like a storm breaking over a fractured land. His son Conrad IV, a legitimate heir, claimed both the German crown and the Kingdom of Sicily. But his claim was contested by William of Holland, a papal puppet already crowned by those loyal to Rome. Meanwhile, in southern Italy, Manfred, Bianca's beloved son, held real power, governing in his half-brother's name but clearly eyeing the throne for himself. What followed was not just political maneuvering, but war. A realm divided by geography, culture, and blood turned on itself. In Germany, Conrad struggled to assert control. Many princes refused to recognize him, citing his southern ties and papal disapproval. Armies loyal to William clashed with imperial forces. Towns changed allegiance overnight. Battles were fought not for unity, but for survival. In the south, Manfred held court in Palermo with the poise of a king, even as he claimed to act only as regent. He was charismatic, cultured, and deeply loved by his mother's allies. But to the church, he was a bastard with a crown-shaped shadow. Then came Conrad's sudden death in 1254, just 4 years after Frederick. The empire had lost its center, and its sons had lost their father, but not their ambition. Manfred now stood alone, ruler in all but name. The Pope, furious at the prospect of a Lancia son claiming kingship, offered the kingdom of Sicily to Charles of Anjou, a French prince with papal backing and a sword thirsty for conquest. The stage was set for full-scale civil war. Brother turned against brother. Cousin against cousin. Nobles switched sides like merchants trading spices. And all across the fractured empire, people prayed for peace even as armies marched beneath banners soaked in fratricide. The once mighty Holy Roman Empire, born from Charlemagne's dreams and Otto's conquests, had become a stage for a bitter family drama, played out with steel and scripture. The unity that had once allowed emperors to challenge popes, to command crusades, to shape the destiny of Europe, now crumbled beneath the weight of bloodlines and betrayal. What had begun with a forbidden love, a whispered wedding, and a woman the church refused to name empress, had become a war of brothers. And in wars like these, no crown emerges untarnished. When the dust of battle settles and the cries of ambition fade, what remains is legacy, often tangled, always contested. For Emperor Frederick II and Bianca Lancia, their legacy was not etched in marble or sealed in scrolls, but carved into the splintered foundations of an empire once destined for greatness. In the years following Frederick's death, the Holy Roman Empire entered what historians would call the Great Interregnum, a time of chaos, when no emperor reigned with undisputed authority, and the crown lay adrift between rival claimants. Central authority disintegrated. Princes ruled their territories like kings. The old imperial idea, forged in Charlemagne's shadow, fractured, not from external invasion, but from within. At the heart of that fracture stood the children of a scandalous union. Manfred, Bianca's son, seized the crown of Sicily in 1258. He did so not as a regent, but as king, defying papal edicts, ignoring questions of legitimacy, and invoking the legacy of his father. His reign was bold, cultured, defiant, a mirror of Frederick's. But it was brief. In 1266, he faced the wrath of Charles of Anjou, the Pope's anointed avenger. At the Battle of Benevento, Manfred's army was crushed. He died on the field, his body left unburied for days, his crown trampled beneath the hooves of a foreign army. Bianca had died years earlier, likely in seclusion. She never wore the title of empress, never walked through the halls of Rome as a crowned consort. But in the annals of history, her presence remained, spectral yet powerful. To the church, she was the symbol of disobedience. To poets, a romantic martyr. To historians, a turning point, the woman whose forbidden love helped destabilize the Holy Roman Empire. The papacy, though victorious in war, had paid its own price. By intervening so deeply in imperial succession, the Church exposed its political ambitions. The spiritual authority it once wielded with unchallenged confidence became tainted with blood. The line between holy and temporal was blurred beyond recognition. Popes had crowned emperors, now they dethroned them. But in doing so, they invited the question, where does divine right end and ambition begin? and so the Holy Roman Empire limped on. Its crown would be passed, debated, and diminished over the centuries. But it would never again be whole. The unity Frederick II had tried to forge, between North and South, between intellect and faith, between empire and love, had died with him and with Bianca. Their marriage had not merely scandalized a court. It had revealed the fragile scaffolding of power built on tradition, expectation, and fear. In many ways, they were ahead of their time. Frederick ruled like a Renaissance prince a century too early. Bianca, with her education, influence, and refusal to remain hidden, lived more like a queen of the Enlightenment than a medieval consort. Together, they envisioned a world governed not just by bloodlines or bishops, but by passion, reason, and mutual respect. But history punishes the bold. Their union became a cautionary tale, a reminder that love in the corridors of power rarely ends without consequence. That crowns are heavy, but hearts, when misaligned with duty, can bring empires to ruin. And yet, in the ashes of that crown, something lingered. Not a kingdom, not a dynasty, but a story of love that refused to kneel, of ambition that would not conform, of an emperor and a woman who dared to write their own vows in the face of an unyielding world. It is a legacy that did not build an empire, but one that reminds us why empires fall.